Hey everyone, welcome back. Tonight, we're wandering into one of the strangest corners of history, the medieval marketplace. Before we bite into this tale, do me a favor. Hit that like button if you love discovering the weird and wonderful side of the past. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Not for the algorithm, but because history is way more fun when we explore it together. So imagine stepping into a medieval market. The smell of smoke clings to your clothes. Mud splashes under boots. People haggle over bread, beer, and scraps of meat. And then hidden between the ale barrels and vegetable carts, you spot something surprisingly familiar, a medieval version of junk food. That's right. Long before vending machines, burger joints, or hot dog stands, people in the Middle Ages had their own guilty pleasures. Some were mouth-watering, some were downright horrifying. But all of them prove one simple truth: humans have always loved snacks. Drop a comment below. What's the one modern snack you could never live without? I'm curious. Tonight, we're diving headfirst into the greasy, sticky, sometimes suspicious world of medieval junk food. From apple fritters hot enough to burn your tongue, to blood pudding balls that sound more like a dare, to candied fennel seeds acting as ancient breath mints, this is food history you definitely didn't learn in school. So grab your favorite snack, a safe one, please, dim the lights, and get ready. You'll never look at junk food the same way again. Apple fritters, the medieval donut. We start with something surprisingly familiar. The apple fritter. Forget about polished supermarket apples. Medieval apples were small, tart, knobbly little things, barely recognizable compared to today's shiny fruit. Cooks chopped them up, dunked them into a rough batter of flour, eggs, and sometimes ale, because clean water was a gamble and ale was safer. Then came the dramatic part: frying. Picture pig fat sizzling in a pan that had been reused so many times it probably had a family tree. The oil hissed, spat, and filled the air with a smell equal parts delicious and questionable. Into that bubbling cauldron went the battered apples, transforming into golden brown fritters that were crisp on the outside, soft inside, and dangerously addictive. Rich households might dust them with imported sugar, a luxury worth flaunting. Everyone else drizzled honey or a spiced syrup on top. Either way, one bite was enough to make you forget about the boiled cabbage waiting at home. But make no mistake, fritters weren't health food. They were street snacks, greasy, messy, and irresistible. Kids begged for them. Adults devoured them after church or during fairs. Even birds swooped in to steal them from distracted hands. When they were good, they were glorious, sweet, crispy, comforting. And when they were bad, burnt, chewy, and still eaten anyway. Because in medieval Europe, a hot fritter was a taste of joy. But apple fritters were only the beginning. Because when people wanted something savory, squeaky, and strangely satisfying, they reached for cheese curds. Cheese curds, the medieval popcorn. If apple fritters were the medieval donut, then cheese curds were the popcorn of their world. Now, don't picture stretchy mozzarella sticks or Instagram-worthy cheese pulls. Medieval cheese curds were humble little lumps of dairy fresh from the cheese-making process, and they squeaked on your teeth when you bit into them, literally. That squeak was either oddly satisfying or mildly alarming, depending on who you asked. So how did they make them? Farmers separated milk into curds and whey using rennet substance from the stomach lining of calves. Not exactly appetizing, but it worked. The curds were pressed, salted, and eaten fresh before they hardened into tough wheels that could survive long winters. These curds weren't luxurious, but they were perfect snacks. Portable, filling, and reliable. Monks loved them. Travelers carried them. Children munched them by the handful like candy. And peasants? They were just relieved to be chewing something that wasn't stale bread pretending to be a meal. Sure, the taste wasn't always consistent. Some curds were soft and creamy, others rubbery enough to bounce. But in a world without refrigeration, expectations were low, and cheese curds felt like a small win. Fry them, crumble them into soups, or eat them plain. The result was the same: comfort food with zero fuss. In many ways, cheese curds were the medieval snack that just showed up when life got rough. They weren't glamorous, but they were dependable. Like that one friend who never throws a party, but always brings bread when you need it. But what happened when people wanted something sweeter, something baked, and had no sugar or fruit? They turned to an unlikely hero, the turnip. Turnip pie, desperation disguised as dessert. Let's be honest, turnips were never meant to be dessert. But in medieval Europe, desperation was often the most powerful recipe. Sugar was expensive. Apples weren't always in season. Honey wasn't always available. So someone, somewhere, looked at a pile of turnips and thought, what if pie? The result was the infamous turnip pie. Imagine mashed turnips mixed with eggs, maybe sweetened with a drizzle of honey or a handful of raisins if the cook felt generous. Then the mixture was baked into a crust of flour and water that was more ambition than flavor. At its best, a turnip pie was warm, slightly sweet, and comforting in the way only root vegetables can be. At its worst, it tasted like livestock feed wrapped in pastry. But here's the thing, people still ate it, and in some places, they even loved it. Why? 2 reasons. Turnips were cheap, and pie crust could hide a multitude of sins. Overripe? Undercooked? Bitter? Just bake it into a pie and pretend it's dessert. For peasants, it was a sweet treat. For nobles, it was beneath them unless they wanted to look relatable to the common folk at feasts. Some recipes went wild with spices like nutmeg or pepper, and occasionally monks tossed in raisins just to confuse everyone. It was never cheesecake, but it was dessert adjacent, and in the Middle Ages, that counted. Turnip pies became the kind of food people didn't brag about, but always brought back. They were cheap, filling, and at least vaguely sweet, which, in a world where most dinners involved onions and broth, was practically revolutionary. And so, from crispy apple fritters to squeaky cheese curds to the humble turnip pie, medieval people found comfort in snacks that were sometimes delicious, sometimes strange, and often just good enough. But when you wanted something portable, indulgent, and hot enough to burn your fingers, you turned to the real star of medieval street food, the meat pasty. Meat pasties, the medieval hot pocket. If there was one snack that defined medieval street food, it was the meat pasty. Think of it as the Middle Ages answer to the hot pocket flaky crust, hearty filling, portable enough to eat while plowing a field or watching a public execution. The genius of the pasty was its convenience. Stuff a mix of meat and spices into dough, fold it, bake it, and you had a handheld meal that could survive being carried for hours. Wrapped in thick pastry, it stayed warm and, more importantly, protected from dirt, rats, or muddy hands. But let's talk about that filling. Meat was a flexible concept in the Middle Ages. If you lived near a manor, you might get pork, mutton, or venison. But for the average peasant, options got creative. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, even hedgehog could end up diced inside. Spices like pepper or sage did their best to hide how questionable the meat really was. Miners often carved their initials into the crust to claim their pasty. Some even had one edge made extra thick so they could hold it with dirty hands and toss the greasy remains to spirits. Or, more realistically, the rats. Were pasties delicious? Often, yes. Were they mysterious? Always, but that was the charm. You didn't ask too many questions. You just ate, enjoyed, and prayed the cook had been in a good mood. And after all that meat, you were going to need something to freshen your breath. Which brings us to a snack that doubled as a digestive aid. Candied fennel seeds, the medieval breath mint. Before chewing gum or Tic Tacs, medieval nobles had candied fennel seeds. Picture tiny fennel seeds with their sharp licorice-like flavor coated in layers of hardened sugar. They were served after banquets as a way to settle the stomach and disguise the smell of roasted goose or spiced mutton clinging to your breath. They weren't easy to make. Sugar was rare and expensive, and coating each seed took patience. That meant only the wealthy had access to these sweet little nuggets of refinement. Eating them was part pleasure, part dental hazard. Bite too confidently, and you risked cracking a tooth. But done right, they gave a sweet crunch followed by that herbal fennel kick. You either loved them or swallowed quickly and pretended. For nobles, they were a way to show class. For peasants, homemade versions with honey and herbs were the knockoff brand. Still, they became a symbol of wealth and hospitality, tiny, fancy, and just indulgent enough to make guests feel special. But when people wanted a dessert that wasn't just small and crunchy, but sticky, chewy, and festival-worthy, they turned to honey cakes. Honey cakes, sticky, sweet, and festival-ready. If medieval desserts had a celebrity, it was the honey cake. Honey was the sweetener of the people, assuming you had access to bees, or weren't afraid of climbing a tree and getting stung in the face. Unlike sugar, which was a rare luxury, honey was available enough to become the foundation of cakes, drinks, and preserves. Medieval honey cakes were dense, chewy, and sticky. The recipe was simple: flour, water, and generous spoonfuls of honey. Sometimes cooks threw in spices like cloves or cinnamon, or added dried fruit to make them extra special. They weren't delicate. Most honey cakes looked like edible bricks, tough enough to double as building material if left out too long. Cutting them required a strong knife, and eating them left your hands glued together with honey. But they were worth it. Sweet, filling, and celebratory. Honey cakes showed up at feasts, weddings, festivals, anytime people wanted to indulge. They also made excellent gifts, bribes, or even subtle insults. Here, I made this cake. It's sweet. Unlike you. Sure, they were heavy and rough, but they carried a sense of joy. In a world of salted fish and boiled cabbage, a sticky honey cake was a rare moment of luxury. So far, we've seen fried donuts, squeaky cheese, turnip, dessert, portable hot pockets, fancy fennel mints, and sticky cakes. Medieval snacking was equal parts clever and questionable. But what about the snacks made from scraps, the crispy, salty, and sometimes downright bizarre inventions? Next up, fried fish skins, ale-soaked bread, and a nobleman's soggy wine-soaked toast. If there was one snack that defined medieval street food, it was the meat pasty. Think of it as the Middle Ages' answer to the hot pocket flaky crust, hearty filling, portable enough to eat while plowing a field or watching a public execution. The genius of the pasty was its convenience. Stuff a mix of meat and spices into dough, fold it, bake it, and you had a handheld meal that could survive being carried for hours. Wrapped in thick pastry, it stayed warm and, more importantly, protected from dirt, rats, or muddy hands. But let's talk about that filling. Meat was a flexible concept in the Middle Ages. If you lived near a manor, you might get pork, mutton, or venison. But for the average peasant, options got creative. Rabbit, pigeon, eel, even hedgehog could end up diced inside. Spices like pepper or sage did their best to hide how questionable the meat really was. Miners often carved their initials into the crust to claim their pasty. Some even had one edge made extra thick so they could hold it with dirty hands and toss the greasy remains to spirits, or, more realistically, the rats. Were pasties delicious? Often, yes. Were they mysterious? Always. But that was the charm. You didn't ask too many questions. You just ate, enjoyed, and prayed the cook had been in a good mood. And after all that meat, you were going to need something to freshen your breath. Which brings us to a snack that doubled as a digestive aid. Candied fennel seeds, the medieval breath mint. Before chewing gum or Tic Tacs, medieval nobles had candied fennel seeds. Picture tiny fennel seeds with their sharp licorice-like flavor coated in layers of hardened sugar. They were served after banquets as a way to settle the stomach and disguise the smell of roasted goose or spiced mutton clinging to your breath. They weren't easy to make. Sugar was rare and expensive, and coating each seed took patience. That meant only the wealthy had access to these sweet little nuggets of refinement. Eating them was part pleasure, part dental hazard. Bite too confidently, and you risked cracking a tooth. But done right, they gave a sweet crunch followed by that herbal fennel kick. You either loved them or swallowed quickly and pretended. For nobles, they were a way to show class. For peasants, homemade versions with honey and herbs were the knockoff brand. Still, they became a symbol of wealth and hospitality, tiny, fancy, and just indulgent enough to make guests feel special. But when people wanted a dessert that wasn't just small and crunchy but sticky, chewy, and festival-worthy, they turned to honey cakes. Honey cakes, sticky, sweet, and festival-ready. If medieval desserts had a celebrity, it was the honey cake. Honey was the sweetener of the people, assuming you had access to bees, or weren't afraid of climbing a tree and getting stung in the face. Unlike sugar, which was a rare luxury, honey was available enough to become the foundation of cakes, drinks, and preserves. Medieval honey cakes were dense, chewy, and sticky. The recipe was simple: flour, water, and generous spoonfuls of honey. Sometimes cooks threw in spices like cloves or cinnamon or added dried fruit to make them extra special. They weren't delicate. Most honey cakes looked like edible bricks, tough enough to double as building material if left out too long. Cutting them required a strong knife, and eating them left your hands glued together with honey. But they were worth it. Sweet, filling, and celebratory. Honey cakes showed up at feasts, weddings, festivals, anytime people wanted to indulge. They also made excellent gifts, bribes, or even subtle insults. Here, I made this cake. It's sweet. Unlike you. Sure, they were heavy and rough, but they carried a sense of joy. In a world of salted fish and boiled cabbage, a sticky honey cake was a rare moment of luxury. So far, we've seen fried donuts, squeaky cheese, turnip dessert, portable hot pockets, fancy fennel mints, and sticky cakes. Medieval snacking was equal parts clever and questionable. But what about the snacks made from scraps, the crispy, salty, and sometimes downright bizarre inventions? Next up, fried fish skins, ale-soaked bread, and a nobleman's soggy wine-soaked toast. Fried fish skins, the medieval potato chip. Sometimes the best snacks are born out of thrift. In the Middle Ages, that meant nothing went to waste, not even fish skin. Imagine a cook staring at a pile of slimy, discarded fish skins. Instead of tossing them to the cats, they tossed them into sizzling hot fat. The result? Fish skin cracklings, crispy, salty, and surprisingly addictive. They weren't glamorous, but they were efficient. Fishermen, sailors, and peasants turned what should have been trash into a snack loud enough to drown out tavern chatter. One crunch and you got the concentrated taste of the ocean, sharp, savory, and undeniably medieval. A sprinkle of salt or garlic elevated them into something almost elegant. Soldiers carried them. Sailors lived off them. Peasants sold them outside inns to feed drunk crowds looking for something crunchy. The only downside, the smell. Frying fish skin indoors guaranteed your house would reek of Poseidon's laundry for a week. But hey, if it tasted good, you didn't complain. But when you weren't chewing crispy ocean chips, you might have been dunking your bread in something far stranger, ale. Bread soaked in ale, the peasants' comfort food. Think of it as medieval French toast, but without sugar, eggs, or joy. For peasants, stale bread was a problem. It was hard, chewy, sometimes strong enough to chip a tooth. But waste was unacceptable, so people dunked it into ale to soften it. And just like that, bread and ale was born. It wasn't fancy craft beer. This was flat, weak ale brewed in smoky back rooms. But when soaked into stale bread, it transformed into a warm, filling mush that peasants could eat quickly before heading back to work. Sometimes cooks added herbs, cheese, or even an egg on feast days. On rare occasions, they spiced the ale with nutmeg for extra flavor. But most of the time, it was just soggy bread that kept you alive. It didn't travel well, leave it too long and you got a sad, sloshy sponge. But for cold evenings by the fire, it was comfort food at its simplest. Meanwhile, nobles had their own version of soggy bread. But with wine, spices, and a whole lot more drama. Sops in wine, the nobles' drunken dessert. If peasants dunked their bread in ale, nobles dunked theirs in wine. Known as sops in wine, this was the medieval elite's idea of a refined treat. Slices of toasted bread were soaked in spiced, mulled wine until soft enough to eat with a spoon. Nobles called it elegant. Commoners called it wet bread in regret. At fancy banquets, sops in wine were served as dessert or as a late-night indulgence to keep guests happy when politics got awkward. Done well, they were warm, sweet, and comforting. Done poorly, it was like chewing through a medieval mistake. Sometimes dried fruits or nuts were added, sometimes even cheese or eggs, which turned it into more of a culinary guessing game than a snack. Peasants occasionally copied the dish with vinegar or cheap ale, but let's be real, wine-soaked bread was for the wealthy. So far, we've seen crunchy fish skins, ale bread for survival, and wine-soaked toasts for the elite. But some medieval snacks walked the line between luxury and dental hazard. Next up, dried fruit, blood pudding balls, and pancakes. Dried fruit, the medieval candy. In the Middle Ages, dried fruit was considered a true delicacy. Raisins, figs, dates, and if you were really wealthy, imported prunes. But let's set expectations. This wasn't the soft, juicy dried fruit you find in trail mix today. Medieval dried fruit was tough, wrinkled, and chewy enough to double as a workout for your jaw. Stored in cloth sacks or clay pots, it hardened with time, turning into what was basically edible treasure. The sweetness, though, was undeniable. Concentrated sugars made dried fruit taste like medieval candy. Nobles loved it. Monks hoarded it. Children treated it like rare loot, and sometimes even hid it from siblings in barns just so they wouldn't have to share. Of course, there were downsides. Raisins clung to your teeth for hours. Dates were sticky enough to glue your molars shut. Figs had seeds that worked like medieval dental floss. Quietly eating them was impossible. But when you finally bit through, you got an explosion of sweetness that made every chew worth it. For nobles, dried fruit was often soaked in wine, wrapped in pastry, or drizzled with rose water. For peasants, it was a once-a-year treat at weddings or religious festivals. Sweet, tough, and a little dangerous dried fruit was proof that in medieval times, dessert came with consequences. But when people weren't chewing through figs, they were biting into something much darker: blood pudding balls. Blood pudding balls, heavy, iron-rich, and bold. If dried fruit was candy, blood pudding balls were something else entirely. Born out of the medieval rule of waste nothing, these snacks were made by mixing fresh animal blood, usually pig, with oats, onions, fat, and spices. The mixture was rolled into balls, fried until crisp, and served hot. The flavor? Rich, heavy, and unmistakably iron. Each bite was a punch to the taste buds. If you ate one, you felt full. If you ate four, you felt like you were preparing for battle. These snacks weren't about elegance, they were about survival. High in calories, cheap to make, and shockingly filling, they were perfect for blacksmiths, laborers, and anyone braving the cold. Nobles dressed them up with pepper or eggs, while peasants were just glad to have something besides cabbage. They were especially popular in winter, when warming your body with fried blood felt like a victory against the cold. But not everyone could handle them. Some disliked the texture, others the very idea. Still, in medieval Europe, flavor was often less important than function, and blood pudding balls delivered on both. But not all medieval snacks were so intense. Some were simple, flat, and fried in enough grease to feed an army. Pancakes. Medieval pancakes, flat, fried, and flexible. Forget fluffy stacks with syrup and butter. Medieval pancakes were thin, tough, and fried in sizzling lard until the edges went crispy. The batter was simple: flour, eggs, and either water or ale. Cooks ladled it onto hot iron griddles. No portion control, no non-stick pans, just hope and grease. The result was a flat, uneven circle that could be eaten hot, rolled up, or stacked like edible armor. Flavor depended on what was available. Add ale, and you got a tangy bite. Add honey, and it was suddenly a sweet treat. Throw in onions or herbs, and it became a savory meal. Pancakes were democratic. Peasants, nobles, monks, and merchants all ate them. They were especially popular during fasting days when meat wasn't allowed. In those moments, pancakes became a loophole: fried, filling, and indulgent without breaking the rules. Were they perfect? No. Sometimes they were scorched, sometimes raw in the middle, sometimes both at once. But they got the job done, and people loved them for it. So far, we've seen chewy dried fruit, daring blood pudding balls, and flat, greasy pancakes. Together, they tell us something important. Medieval snacks weren't just about indulgence, they were about creativity, survival, and making the most of whatever you had. But the story doesn't end there. Some medieval treats were thin, fragile, and almost holy. Others were sticky, jeweled candies reserved for the rich. And one of the most beloved yet strangest was slippery, wriggly, and fried to perfection. That's where we're headed next. Wafers, thin, crisp, and holy snacks. If you've ever had a modern wafer cookie, forget it. Medieval wafers were nothing like that. They were thin, crisp biscuits made from flour, water, and eggs, sometimes flavored with a touch of honey or rose water. Cooked between scorching hot metal irons like a medieval panini press, they came out light, brittle, and stamped with patterns ranging from floral swirls to saints' faces. Wafers were cheap, fast, and popular. Vendors sold them outside churches, especially on feast days, where hungry parishioners snapped them up by the dozen. Imagine stepping out of Mass, hearing a merchant shout, "Hot wafers here." It was the medieval equivalent of grabbing a funnel cake at a fair. They were fragile, though. One wrong move and they shattered into edible confetti. Storing them was nearly impossible, which made eating them immediately part of the fun. Nobles sometimes layered them with fruit or soft cheese, while peasants ate them plain. Light, crispy, celebratory wafers were medieval proof that not every snack had to weigh you down like a sack of bricks. But if wafers were fragile, the next medieval treat was the opposite. Glossy, chewy, and so sweet it doubled as edible treasure. Suck-it, candy for the rich. Suck-it was the medieval candy you flaunted when you wanted everyone to know you were rich. It was made by boiling fruits like oranges, dates, or ginger in syrup until they were preserved, chewy, and gleaming like jewels. Sometimes they were soft and syrupy, sometimes dried and rolled in sugar cubes. Either way, they were a display of wealth as much as they were a treat. Sugar was expensive. It had to be imported, refined, and worked by hand. That meant suck-it wasn't for peasants chewing stale onions, it was for nobles showing off at feasts. At banquets, trays of suck-it were passed around like edible gold coins. Guests would smile, pop one in their mouth, and immediately regret not grabbing more. For commoners, there were no suck-it jars on the table. At best, they might lick a spoon used in the kitchen and dream about what luxury tasted like. Sweet, glossy, and utterly extravagant, suck-it wasn't just candy, it was a status symbol. But if candy fruit was the food of nobles, the next snack was loved across the board. Slimy when raw, bony when cooked, yet somehow one of the most popular snacks of the Middle Ages, fried eel. Fried eel, slippery, crispy, and strangely beloved. Yes, eel. Medieval Europe was obsessed with it. Rivers and streams were full of them, making eel cheap, easy to catch, and believe it or not delicious when fried. Catching them wasn't pleasant. They writhed like wet ropes, slippery and determined to escape. Skinning them was even worse, like wrestling a snake that didn't want to die. But once chopped, seasoned, and thrown into bubbling fat, eel transformed into something crispy, rich, and oddly addictive. Fried eel wasn't just peasant food. It showed up everywhere, from roadside inns to royal banquets. Nobles loved flaunting it. Monks ate it during religious fasts, since it wasn't technically classified as meat, and kings had it stuffed into pies and paraded across tables. Yes, it was bony. Yes, it sometimes wriggled after death. But when fried, it rivaled calamari or fish and chips. Crunchy on the outside, tender inside, and greasy enough to make you feel dangerously indulgent. For medieval people, fried eel wasn't weird. It was normal and beloved. Today, it might make us squeamish, but in their world, it was a delicacy that fed everyone from paupers to kings. And that, my friends, brings us to the end of our medieval snack tour. From holy wafers to jeweled succat to slippery fried eel, we've seen the full spectrum of medieval junk food: cheap, creative, luxurious, and bizarre. But what does it all tell us about the people who ate it? That's where we finish with the grand conclusion. What medieval junk food really meant. So, what have we learned from this medieval snack tour? That even in a world of mud streets, smoky kitchens, and questionable hygiene, people still crave the same thing we do today: comfort food. They wanted something quick, something indulgent, something that made life feel a little brighter, even if it came wrapped in pig fat or smelled like fish left out too long. Apple fritters weren't just fried apples. They were tiny bites of joy in a diet ruled by cabbage and turnips. Cheese curds weren't just squeaky lumps of dairy. They were portable comfort. Honey cakes stuck to your hands, blood pudding balls stuck to your ribs, and wafers stuck to your teeth. But every one of them reminded medieval people that food could be more than survival. It could be pleasure. And maybe that's the real secret of medieval junk food. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't healthy, and it definitely wasn't clean, but it was human. It was laughter in the marketplace, kids fighting over fritters, monks sneaking curds, nobles passing around jeweled candy fruits. It was proof that no matter how harsh life got, people always found a way to snack. Because at the end of the day, junk food isn't about nutrition. It's about joy. It's about comfort. It's about the little indulgences that make the world feel less heavy, even if that indulgence is fried eel. So the next time you bite into a donut, crunch a chip, or sneak a candy you swore you wouldn't eat, remember, you're part of a tradition that stretches back centuries. Humans have always chased snacks. The flavors change, but the craving never does. And maybe, just maybe, that's the most medieval thing of all. If you enjoyed this trip into medieval junk food, let me know in the comments. Which of these snacks would you try and which one would you run from? And don't forget, the past is always stranger, greasier, and tastier than we imagine.